Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name is Daheen Gustav, and I will be providing technical assistance during the meeting. Due to Tropical Storm Elsa, the presentation that you will see today was pre-recorded, but it will be followed by a live Q&A. Closed captioning and ASL interpreting are being provided. To view the interpreter, set your screen to gallery view. You can switch between gallery and speaker view in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. To view the captioning, click on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen and select subtitles. All attendee microphones have been muted to avoid background noise, and we ask that you do not turn on your webcam. During the Q&A, please use the chat box to ask a question. Your question will be read out loud by the session moderator for the presenter to answer. This presentation is being recorded, and the recording will be made available for future viewing. It is now my pleasure to turn it over to Ann Ordway, Program Specialist at the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living and Rehabilitation Research. Ann, please go ahead.
Welcome to the NIDLR-sponsored webinar series on social isolation and loneliness for people with disabilities. This is the first in a four-part series on the research on social isolation and loneliness for people with disabilities conducted by NIDLR grantees and their collaborators. Today's webinar is titled Social Isolation and Spinal Cord Injury, Findings from the 50-Year Spinal Cord Injury Longitudinal Aging Study by Drs. James Krause and Dr. Susan Newman. I'm very pleased to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Krause and Newman. Dr. Krause is a distinguished university professor and associate dean for research in the College of Health Professions at the Medical University of South Carolina. Motivated by his own spinal cord injury of nearly 50 years, his career has been committed to research that helps us understand the ever-changing challenges faced by people with spinal cord injury and other severe disabling conditions. Dr. Krause's research addresses fundamental gaps in our knowledge of quality of life, participation, social isolation, longevity, opioid and substance use, and aging and health following spinal cord injury. He currently serves as a principal investigator of the 50-Year Spinal Cord Injury Longitudinal Aging Study, funded as a NIDLR Disability Rehabilitation Research Project, which is investigating changes in participation as individuals age with spinal cord injury, including the prevalence and consequences of social isolation. Dr. Newman is an associate professor and the assistant dean of the PhD in Nursing Science program in the College of Nursing at the Medical University of South Carolina. Dr. Newman is a certified rehabilitation registered nurse and developed her expertise in rehabilitation nursing during 13 years of clinical practice and acute inpatient medical rehabilitation, caring for individuals with a variety of disabilities, including spinal cord injury. Dr. Newman's current research investigates the role of peer mentoring in the process of adapting to life with a spinal cord injury and learning to self-manage consequences of the injury successfully. She is also interested in the effects of peer support on social isolation after spinal cord injury. Her research includes application of community-engaged approaches to address issues affecting community participation, health, and overall quality of life of individuals with spinal cord injury. She has received funding from NIDLR, NIH, AHRQ, and the Rehabilitation Nursing Foundation. We will now begin the presentation.
Hello, I'm Jim Krause, and it's a great pleasure to be with you today and to be able to make this presentation. We are truly honored to be able to make the first in the series of presentations by ACL on social isolation and loneliness. And we are going to talk about findings from our 50-year longitudinal study within the context of the larger topic. My co-presenter is Dr. Susan Newman, who is a PhD nurse professor at the Medical University of South Carolina, and Dr. Chow Lee, who is not here. He is actually presenting at the American Spinal Injury Association meeting on a different topic. So first, we'll just do a brief acknowledgement. NIDLR is funding our work, We are very grateful for this, and this is 50 years of work. NIDLR has funded all but the first, actually the second and third cycle of the work. And within the acknowledgement, I would be remiss if I did not acknowledge the participants who have been at the heart of this study. The picture you see is from a celebration in 2005, where we celebrated the 40-year anniversary of the study. I think there are 49 people in this picture. A couple we brought with us from South Carolina, but the rest were research participants, 20 or more years post-injury. I believe all of them. We had 10, 50 plus years post-injury. And I'd also like to thank the team, Melinda Jarnicki in particular, who is helping us and with this presentation and with the slides. But it takes a whole team of people in partnership with people with cord injury to do this work. And I will turn it over to Susan, who will give us overview, background, talk about the literature. Then I'll talk about the study and our findings. And then I'll turn it back to Susan to put the work within the context of what it really means and how the findings can be used.
Great, thank you. Yes, thank you for everybody for joining us today. So we wanted to start by providing an overview of our presentation. So first, we'll start by describing social isolation. What is it? Not only because we're the first presentation in this series, but also to introduce how we have conceptualized social isolation in our studies. Then we'll talk about why do we care? What are the consequences of being socially isolated and how does that affect health outcomes? Then we'll turn to focusing more specifically on spinal cord injury and what does social isolation look like in the context of spinal cord injury using data that's been generated through Dr. Krause's 50-year SCI longitudinal aging study. And we'll talk about what that contributes to what we know about social isolation after spinal cord injury and how we can use that knowledge to help improve the lives of people with spinal cord injury. Next. So first, what is social isolation? So over the past several decades, there's been an increased recognition that there are factors beyond the biology that affect a person's health. And so these factors have been identified as the social determinants of health, which really reflect the social context in which people conduct their lives and its relationship to health. So availability of and access to social support and social relationships are really an important social determinant of health, as these relationships provide not only emotional support, but practical supports and resources that are necessary. And so social isolation occurs when there is a lack of these social connections and supports. Next, thank you. So studying social isolation can be tricky as it really is a very complex phenomenon. So it's not a one-size-fits-all phenomenon, and there are many different ways people may experience social isolation, just as there are many factors at both the individual person level as well as the environmental level that can affect this experience. So there is no one definition of social isolation, and it's defined multiple ways throughout the research literature. Most commonly, it's used interchangeably with loneliness, but as you'll see, it can really encompass much more than that. There is notable growth in research on social isolation over the past year. So a quick search in PubMed using the search term social isolation shows that the number of published studies more than doubled from 2019, where there were approximately 2,100 papers, to 2020, when it was 4,500 papers about. And there are a lot of variances in how social isolation is defined in this research literature. So there's a real need for a common language and clear definitions of social isolation and how it's measured. So how does the information across studies compare and contrast? And what does this mean across different populations? So typically there are two dimensions of social isolation that are identified in the research literature. There's the objective dimension, which allows us to quantify and measure a person's social networks, the number of contacts they have, the frequency of these contacts. And then there's this subjective dimension, which really, this more reflects the emotional state and how they are feeling and how they perceive whether or not their needs are met or not met. And so for our investigations of social isolation, we used the model that was developed by Cornwell and Waite, and this was in a population of older adults in studying social isolation among that population. And so here they identify the objective component of social isolation as social disconnectedness. So this is having a small social network, lack of contact with others, etc. And then the subjective dimension is identified as perceived isolation, and this is the feelings of loneliness and lack of social support. And so there have been some studies looking at the relationship between social disconnectedness and perceived isolation. It really is not a linear relationship that appears to be very interactive and reciprocal. And so studies have shown that being socially disconnected or having few social contacts can lead to loneliness and perceptions of inadequate social support and depression. However, we've also seen that subjective feelings of loneliness can predispose people to avoiding social contacts and becoming more disconnected and depressed. Also, personality traits may affect how social disconnectedness and perceived isolation relate with each other. So it may be that people with few social connections are kind of introverts, and so they don't feel lonely or isolated. And then people with many social connections may still feel that they are indeed isolated. And so again, the combined and interactive effects of these two dimensions on health outcomes is not well studied either. So why do we care about social isolation? So there's a copious amount of literature looking at social isolation in older adults. And we know that there are some characteristics of this population that put them at significant risk for being socially isolated. So loss of spouse and friends. So their friends age and pass away, and so they lose a number of contacts in the community. Change in health status and medical comorbidities. So there may be decline in health status that prevents people from going out and engaging socially. Decreased mobility and increased disability, so more functional challenges that make it more difficult to go out and engage socially, as well as cognitive decline. There are more studies, a growing number of studies, I should say, that include younger populations now in the context of social isolation. Obviously, with the impact of COVID-19, there are more studies looking specifically at that, and there are a few studies looking at different populations with disabilities. So again, to look at the effect of social isolation on health outcomes in older adults, this was really striking to me to see it put this way, that it's comparable to smoking or obesity as a risk factor for poor health. So meta-analyses, which are studies of studies, have found that social isolation or loneliness in older adults is associated with a 30% increased risk of coronary artery disease or stroke, a 50% increased risk of developing dementia, and a 26% increased risk of all-cause mortality. And these risk factors are indeed bidirectional. So developing dementia or a medical condition can also put you at risk for social isolation. So shifting gears a little bit to talk about spinal cord injury, it'd be easy for us to assume that everyone really knows about spinal cord injury, but I realize that's likely not the case. So spinal cord injury can happen in an instant and results in varying degrees of paralysis depending on the level and the severity of the injury. So generally higher levels of injury, so comparing a cervical level injury with thoracic injury, and more complete damage to the spinal cord result in greater impairment. And so the resulting loss of mobility, function, and sensation after spinal cord injury can really affect the injured individual's home life, their personal relationships, vocational and social activities, and their healthcare needs. According to the National Spinal Cord Injury Statistical Center, there are an estimated 294,000 people with spinal cord injury in the United States, with approximately 18,000 new cases of spinal cord injury each year. Vehicle crashes are the most common leading cause of injury, followed by falls, acts of violence, and sporting activities. 78% of injuries are male, and the average age of injury in the U.S. is around 43 years old, which for many individuals are potentially the most productive years of their life. And we also know that time in acute care and rehab has declined since the 1970s, and this can result in reduced opportunities before discharged home to really learn the new knowledge and skills that people need to really navigate life with spinal cord injury well. Next, please. So what do we know about spinal cord injury, and how can this lead to risk for social isolation? So with the paralysis, there become mobility and functional limitations. So people may become dependent on a wheelchair, or they may require assistance for dressing and bathing activities of daily living. There's a loss of independence. With higher levels of injury, people are often reliant on a caregiver or a care partner, or someone to help them out, even from getting out of the bed to transportation. There's also the psychological adjustment adaptation that has to come to adjust with this new acutely onset disability. And that can certainly prevent people from feeling like they want to go out and engage. Bladder and bowel dysfunction and management routines are really a factor that can inhibit people's willingness to go out. The risk of bowel accidents and incontinence, having to time when you do your bowel program really can create a risk for being socially isolated. Also, the high risk of secondary conditions such as pressure injuries and urinary tract infections. These are common and they can become severe enough where people are required to stay in bed for prolonged amounts of time or even be hospitalized. And there's also, we have to consider the environment and how accessibility of the environment may affect people's ability to engage in social activities. Next, please. And so this is a photograph that was taken from a study I did several years ago where I used a research method called photo voice, where I gave people with spinal cord injury cameras to photograph from the community from their perspective. And this one really speaks well to the experience of social isolation. This is a photograph of some brick steps into a local restaurant here. And the photographer says, these aren't just any steps. These steps lead the way to social interactions between my friends from work, insights into private jokes, and the company of people I really enjoy. There is no ramp. These steps are my enemy. And so what do we know so far about social isolation and spinal cord injury? So although it's been well studied in older adults, the research on social isolation in the context of spinal cord injury is relatively sparse. And so the studies that are out there have shown that after spinal cord injury, there is a loss or change in social relationships, that people are perceiving a lack of companionship and feel that they're being left out or isolated from others. Consistent with what we have seen in our data, higher levels of injury are associated with increased vulnerability for social isolation, and that there are negative associations between feelings of loneliness and mental health and life satisfaction. One protective factor that's been identified in the literature is that a greater number of family members within the household has been associated with better physical and mental health. And so now I will turn it over to Dr. Krause to talk about the longitudinal aging study.
Susan, thank you very much for bringing all that previous work and research within the context of spinal cord injury. So I will talk about the SCI longitudinal aging study, which I've been privileged to work with for the past 40 years. Next. So just as a brief background in history, the SCI longitudinal aging study was initiated way back in 1973 by my mentor, Dr. Nancy Crew at the University of Minnesota Hospital. And so I began involvement in 1984 when I was a psychology intern, maybe it was 83. And the study was very straightforward. The goal was to better understand the life situation of people with spinal cord injury who were living in the community. And very little was known at that time. So this wasn't intended as an aging study or a big study. It was a one-time, let's get a snapshot, let's figure out what's going on with people. And this was interesting that it coincided with the passing of the Americans with Disability Act in 1973. So this again, what started out as this inquiry when I joined Nancy as a psychology intern. She had allowed me to look back at some of the data with the potential of doing a publication. And as it turned out, I said, well, we really need to look at this some more and collect more data. And that's what we've been doing ever since. So this study actually started with the original SCI Model Systems grant and at the University of Minnesota. And most people are familiar, there's a network of SCI Model Systems, but this is not the SCI Model Systems database, which is housed at the Statistical Center at UAB. That's routine data collected. This was a specific study. Next. So just a quick overview of participant recruitment. At the time of enrollment, everyone had traumatic SCI, not disease related, and they were a minimum of 2 years post-injury at the time of enrollment, and all of them were adults. So again, this was a cross section from the community. They were on average, I believe, 10 years post-injury. So we did not start the recruitment at the time of injury, but took a cross section of people already in the community. And over the years, we have recruited 5 cohorts from various locations, including the University of Minnesota Hospital, Sister Kenny Institute in Minneapolis. And then when I moved to the Shepherd Center in 1989, the next time we collected data in 1993, we collected a cohort from Shepherd. And basically, we've added new cohorts of people every 10 years through 3 different occasions, anyway, over 10-year intervals through 2003. Next. So this is just a table of the participants. And in 1973, we had 256 participants. And I'm just going to advance this table forward so you can see the growth and development of the study. So the first follow-up was an 11-year follow-up. Again, it was not planned at the time the study was started, but we followed up, and 154 of those original 256 participants stayed in the study. It was a pretty low non-response rate. We, of course, lost some folks to mortality, and we recruited another cohort of 193 people. And so now advancing 10 years forward, 2 follow-ups. We did follow-ups at 15 and 20 years. And you can see that in the 20-year follow-up in 1993, we added our third and our fourth cohorts. The third was from Minnesota, and the fourth was from Shepherd in Atlanta. And you can see the number of participants is going up and the number of total assessments. And then at 30 years, we again added 1 more cohort. This is from Atlanta. Again, the Shepherd Center, 965 people. So the cohort has continued to grow over time. And then the last of these slides shows where we were at the last time of measurement with 45 years post-injury data. We are currently funded to go and collect data on 50 years, and we will add 800 new people. But what you can see from this is we've added 2,210 people over the course of the study. That's a lot of people with spinal cord injury. They've completed over 6,500 assessments. And when you look down a column, for instance, like S1, when you see that number getting smaller each year, it's because there's attrition. The primary source of attrition has been mortality. With rare exception, we've not re-enrolled people. So they have had to participate on each occasion. We've gone to extreme lengths to get their participation. And so when you see 30 people in that S1, they've participated all the way back. There may be 1 or 2 exceptions, but typically we have data going all the way back on them to when they were enrolled, and it's the same for every cohort. So the data is very complete, and that's been a great source of strength for our work. Next. So I mentioned the SCI model systems, which does routine data collection, enrolls people at injury, and does routine data collection. So just to differentiate why our study is so important in terms of aging. And there are some caveats in this table in terms of intervals. We say 1 to 10, it's actually 1 to 12, and then 13 to 22. There's a window on each side of those major groupings. So that those are the midpoints. And we've grouped it for the purpose of just showing you the differences. You can see the vast numbers of cases within the SCI model systems, or the vast number of follow-ups compared to what we have done. But you can see as you go across the row that, and you get to 45 years post-injury, 50, 55, and 60 years post-injury, we have had a lot of people who have completed those assessments. And again, we have assessments back to their first participation, and that's helped us to address a lot of issues. Next. And so in terms of measurement, the original life situation questionnaire was developed simply to get an overview of what was going on with people. And it was very general in nature: demographic, injury characteristics, ADLs, general activities, general health, healthcare utilization, meaning things like hospitalizations and physician visits, and then 6 life satisfaction items and an adjustment scale. So we've kept that core the same, but we've expanded over the years. And so once we've added something, we have worked to make a point to not stop measuring it and jump around much. But we have added new items. We added self-reported problems in '84. We expanded on that, expanded on the satisfaction items, and we added health indicators that are used by CDC, and then some of the new measures from PROMIS. So next, I just want to note some of the challenges for people with aging with SCI. So when we go in again, and I'm going to bring this back to social isolation before we're done, but first we have to say, what happens when people age with a spinal cord injury? And the first thing that I will say is that, there is a survival effect. So people who are better adjusted are more likely to live. People that are more active, that are employed, that have a higher quality of life, and people that do healthier behaviors. So we see that at the beginning, and I'll just say that as a backdrop. And then I'm going to talk about some specific things. And what you see here on this graph is a publication by Cynthia Lee, who is working with our colleague Craig Bellozo. And we had ADL items in the study forever, but never really analyzed them. They were a little bit awkward items because they were developed in '73 before all the standardized measures. And Craig Bellozo is an expert in Roche item analysis, and he helped us to scale our items. So he and Cynthia and other colleagues took 20 years of data, and they scaled it. At the left side is the first time point, and the right side is the second. And they were able to scale the items. So the most difficult thing to do in the ADL or IADL was walk. The least difficult was wheelchair use, feeding independently, and you can see the different things that are somewhere between. So he grouped these. We looked according to injury severity and looked at changes over time. It's really one of my favorite studies from the overall study, or favorite analyses, because you can see there are declines over time. And you can see that for people with thoracic lumbar injuries, they don't see a great deal of decline, but they're still very functional. These are scaled scores on the ends. And you can see that for people with C5, C8 spinal cord injuries, those are people that are pretty functional if they're strong and able, but they do lose some function, and they are less likely to do things. And some of these things are very pragmatic, like bowel care, catheter care. We're talking on average. Some people can continue to do those things. Some people cannot. Some people never could. But the point is that over time, there's a loss of function. There's a loss of the ability to do those things. And with that loss of ability over time, with aging, people are going to need more services. They're going to need help with some things that they could do themselves. The biggest decline for people C1, C4, and that's important. Although a lot of the people with the really high injuries weren't independent in a lot of activities to start. So we do notice that there's a change in function over time. So this is from a paper we did among people with exceptional survival. And so these, again, there's a survivor effect. So healthy people tend to stay in the study longer. But you can see this is just a very dramatic slide. And it shows from baseline to are 11, 20, 30, and 40-year follow-ups. These are not 40-year follow-ups right at the injury time. This is of people who were in the study 40 years. So many of them were 50 years post-injury by then. But what we noticed over time was all of a sudden we got to the 40-year follow-up and we saw just a dramatic increase in physician visits. Now, I don't think it held up as strongly when we preliminarily looked at the next set of data, but still you can see there is a substantial increase in healthcare utilization. Next, please. And a similar, but maybe a little less dramatic trend with hospitalization. So it was high initially, but over the time frame for these, again, these are people that survived all the way through the first 40 years of our study. And so you see the increase in the portion of people who spent a week or more in the hospital in the 2 years prior to the study. And, again, people are facing additional problems, additional concerns, and keeping in mind, you have to need to be in the hospital these days to be in the hospital. There's a tendency to get people out much quicker. So again, this is just another one of the things people are facing. Next. So what about adaptation with aging? And again, we're talking about people that are survivors. Next. So this graph, when Nancy started the study, she asked people two things. What is your current adjustment level and where do you expect to be in 5 years? And the dashed line is where they expect to be in 5 years. And initially it was higher. It has tended to decline over time. So people thinking, oh boy, it's going to be bad in 5 years, or it's going to be worse, or at least that's the overall trend. Not dramatic, but just some slight downward trend. But the interesting thing, we also asked people at the time, rank your current adjustment on a scale of 1 to 10, and that has remained constant, even improved. So even though people are facing a lot of things, the people that survive tend to be very resilient. They tend to maintain their adjustment, and they tend to do well even through difficult times. Next. So what about, now let's get to social isolation. So this is simply a table of a paper done by Dr. Chowley, who is presenting in Asia right now, cannot be with us. But this is simply the cross-sectional relationships between years post-injury and a problems factor that was derived from the original LSQ dating back to 1984. It's not the measures we're going to talk about ultimately today, but just a general measure. And what you see is that it's not very highly correlated with years post-injury. And where it is significantly correlated, the times we obtained a significant correlation, really on the order of 0.09 or 0.1, it was a negative correlation, meaning more years post-injury, lower social isolation. So again, there's a picture that people, as they get older, everything gets terrible, and but we find people are pretty resilient. Next. And there's a much more detailed table from the same paper. And what, again, so I will ask you to follow down the estimate column. And if you look at years since injury at baseline, this is now these are coefficients. So difficult to interpret magnitude, although we do see statistical significance. All that means is exactly what I had just said, that when we look at a cross-section at a baseline measure, there is a relationship where people who have more years post-injury to have lower social isolation. When we look at rate of change follow-up, that negative number simply means social isolation actually decreases longitudinally. It did in this study. This is perceived self-reported problems with social isolation. So it is the subjective component Susan talked about. And then the interaction is significant, which only means that over time, the change becomes less profound. So people initially more social, higher social isolation, and then it tending to decrease over time. Once it starts decreasing, then plateaus out and does not decrease very quickly. We did not find a significant relationship within our model with age at injury onset. So it really was the aging effect of years post-injury and people's experience with SCI. And I won't belabor many of the other points other than years of education, as you would expect, more education, less social isolation. And then at the bottom, you'll see the highest social isolation coefficient, 0.28, was among people who were C1 to C4 non-ambulatory, and then people C5 to C8. So more severe injury, more strong perceptions. Yes, I feel the social isolation. Next. And now I'll talk about our newer research. So with measurement, we measured perceived isolation and we measured social disconnectedness. These are the constructs that Susan talked about initially. And so we had a very sophisticated measurement model, and it was done with structural equation modeling. I don't know how many people are familiar with that. I'm sure the academicians are. But the bottom line is I could show you some graphs with a lot of lines and a lot of circles and a reduction of information as we go. But the bottom line is that we used for perceived isolation, the subjective component, we used 4 scales from the PROMIS, and then some of the scales that came from the original LSQ. Next. And for social disconnectedness, again, we used primarily LSQ items and some items from the Craig Handicap Assessment and Reporting Technique, outstanding measure of participation that's been so wonderful within the field for so long. And within our structural modeling, this again was another manuscript by Dr. Chow Lee, and Chow included 7 indicators actually of social disconnectedness to create a latent variable. And I won't get into the methodology of that, but it's not a direct addition of items. It defines the construct of social disconnectedness by measuring a number of things that you would think conceptually would go with it and things that go with it statistically, and things like being in a committed relationship, people coming to see you, getting out of the house regularly, staying away from home, and then participating in things like social activities or volunteer activities. So in our 5-year analyses of perceived isolation and social disconnectedness, what we did is we tested hypotheses using a single point in time, and Susan published a paper on this with Dr. Lee doing the analyses. And then the relationship of those parameters with other factors, demographic, injury characteristics. Then we did a longitudinal model, a 5-year model, where we actually looked at, okay, this, so how does social disconnectedness and perceived isolation predict future perceived isolation, and how do they predict depressive symptoms? And these are key questions. Next. And so this is a very big model. I would say ignore the parts on the far left and the right and focus on the 3 circles in the middle. And the first 2 circles, you'll see the arrow between perceived isolation and social disconnectedness at baseline. That simply shows that the subjective perceived isolation and the objective are fairly highly related at 0.68. So that is a significant relationship, not just statistically, but they are very, very much related. And then if you look at the line on the bottom from the left-hand circle to the right, that is future perceived isolation. and that's related 0.8. And so that's a very high coefficient. And what that basically means is if you feel isolated now, if you're likely to feel isolated. If you sort of group people based on their level of isolation, those that are high at one point, they're likely to stay high. So that speaks to some of the difficulties in intervention and that up. And then secondly, you'll notice the middle circle, social disconnectedness measured at one point in time does predict future isolation. So anything that you can expect that if people are disconnected, they don't have those connections, they're not going out, they're likely to report a great deal of perceived isolation in the future. And that's a concern. We're trying to get away from that. Next. So this table is simply, if we go back one slide, this table will explain what are called exogenous factors within a model. It's just a big term, but it basically means, measuring characteristics and linking them with the latent traits, the constructs. And so this is simply the relationship between these other variables with perceived isolation and social disconnectedness. Next slide. And then to looking at the ones that are in bold, you can see what are statistically significant. And I'd actually draw attention to the bottom row, years since injury. It was negatively correlated with perceived isolation at baseline. It was it was negatively correlated with social disconnectedness at baseline and also with perceived isolation at follow-up. So again, that same thing where people with more years post-injury actually doing better. And then I would draw your attention in the middle to the two correlations. Again, we see social disconnectedness is higher among people who have cervical injuries. Actually was a bit higher for some reason with C5 to C8 rather than C1 to C4. But again, in general, that is a relationship between greater severity and more isolation. And we did see an effect of race ethnicity where Black and white non-Hispanics actually had lower perceived isolation than the group that was others grouped together where we did not have large enough numbers to individually break them out. Next. Okay, so now I'm going to go toward wrapping up on my end of the presentation. And the last thing we are doing currently, hopefully paper will be submitted very shortly, and that is we looked at the relationship of, again, the social disconnectedness, which actually is on the left in this figure, and that being the objective indicator of social contacts and such, and the perceived isolation on the right, the subjective component. Well, how does that relate to depression? And this is depressive symptoms. And depressive symptoms was measured with the patient health questionnaire number 9, or 9 item, excuse me, not number 9. And you can see there are significant relationships between each of these factors. So the relationships between each of the two latent factors with depression symptoms is less than it is of the relationship between each other. You see at the bottom, but you see that perceived isolation a little more strongly correlated with the depressive symptoms. And then we'll advance the slide. And you can see that then when we measure in 5 years down the line, the predictive nature, you see perceived isolation on the right, still a 0.46 coefficient with future depressive symptoms, simply meaning if somebody's isolated, feels isolated now, they're not only more likely to report depressive symptoms now, but they will in 5 years. And then there's a little bit more of a modest relationship between the actual disconnectedness and future depressive symptoms. Now, sometimes that has to do with the method of measurement, since when you're asking people's isolation, it's subjective. When you ask them depressive symptoms, that's subjective. When you ask them about objective things like social disconnectedness, sometimes those things don't predict subjective outcomes as well as other subjective items. So a methodologist would say there is some method variance, but the bottom line is in that, if people feel isolated, if they have social disconnectedness subjectively within their environment, then they are likely to maintain that over time. Next. So I'm going to turn it back to Susan, who will put this all in context for us and draw some conclusions. Thank you.
Thank you. So just to summarize some of the key findings from this research, when we look at the individual factors that affect social isolation after spinal cord injury, we found that participants with higher levels of education were less likely to report feeling isolated. And we recognize that level of education may reflect the influence of other socioeconomic factors like income and access to resources. So there's more work to be done there. Not surprisingly, and consistent with other studies, the higher level and severity of injury was associated with higher levels of social disconnectedness. I mean, you can correspond that to the higher level of disability that's experienced by those participants. And this last point is probably one of the most interesting findings, I think. And while participants in the aging study may have experienced more health problems over time, their social isolation decreased, which suggests resilience and adaptation. Next. And so just to focus a little bit more on the seemingly protective nature of time since injury, it demonstrated the inverse relationship to both dimensions of social isolation. So not only the social disconnectedness, but the perceived isolation. Those who had survived more than 40 years with spinal cord injury really appeared to be highly resilient, so that some of the decreases could reflect that survivor effect that Jim mentioned. So it's important to continue to conduct longitudinal examinations so we can really understand what this trajectory over time for perceived isolation and social disconnected looks like, and how we can frame that also within the context of aging with spinal cord injury. So next. So as a nurse, thinking about the clinical relevance or how this knowledge can help to improve the lives of people with spinal cord injury really is of utmost importance. And so findings from this longitudinal aging study really can inform the development of predictive models for social isolation after spinal cord injury to really help characterize who is at risk, to help us understand the relationship between the objective and subjective dimensions of social isolation in the context of spinal cord injury, and to really begin to look at the reciprocal relationship between social isolation and post-injury physical and mental health. So as Dr. Krause mentioned, we're looking at depression and how that relates to social isolation. And also identification of these factors that mediate the presence or effects of social isolation. And that's really important to understand as we look towards developing interventions. Next. And so just briefly thinking about some interventions that we could consider to target social isolation after spinal cord injury. And so how could we integrate screening for social isolation risk during acute recovery and rehab to inform how discharge planning for people with spinal cord injury? What strategies could we use to expedite coping and adjustment, adaptation of social goals and expectations after injury? How can we minimize disruption of the structure and composition of social networks after injury? So as we stated, people feel more socially disconnected, so it means they're engaging less with their friends and social connections. Providing community-based social supports is really important. This has been very successful in the US and in Great Britain for the aging population. And so peer support is very popular among the spinal cord injury community. And so capitalizing on some of the relationships that can occur between peers after spinal cord injury is one potential strategy to help mitigate social isolation. And the other thing that we've all become keenly aware of since the COVID-19 pandemic is how can we use technology to really facilitate social connections. So, another Zoom or Teams meeting, to help people stay connected may not be a bad thing. So in conclusion, I think it's quite clear from the data that people with spinal cord injury are at risk for social isolation, and there are some unique risk factors associated with injury that can compound the risk of aging. The seemingly protective nature of time since injury really warrants more investigation. And so I feel like we're really only starting to scratch the surface here. So there's really a lot more work to be done in this area, not only describing the problem, but studying interventions to help mitigate it. And so I will stop there because I believe we are at time. So thank you very much for your attention.
And thank you, Susan. I will just add that we are recording this today because we have a tropical storm coming in tomorrow, maybe knocked out. Also, I have one correction. I said our get together in 2005, it was 2015. And we are planning on bringing all the people that we can together again in 2023 for a celebration to commemorate the 50 years of the study. And we'll look forward to answering questions for you tomorrow. I believe we're live for questions now.
Yes, we are.
Yes, thank you, Drs. Kraus and Newman. We are live for questions. And again, just as a reminder to submit those questions into the chat box, and I will be looking for those questions there. So as the audience is putting their questions in, I'll actually start off with a question of my own. And it's a practical question, but maybe one that's difficult to answer. So we know when we talk about, and I want to use your framing, kind of the subjective experience of social isolation, and I'm going to use the word loneliness. So loneliness is often stigmatized, and we don't admit when we're lonely. As the individual with spinal cord injury, with regards to individuals with spinal cord injuries and their friends and family, how do we start that conversation about loneliness?
That's a great question. As a clinician, my mind is turning here. I guess just creating an environment where people feel comfortable, sharing their feelings. Obviously, it would probably be most likely with someone that they feel close to, primarily the family members. And that may be one reason we saw, in that one study that showed having family members in the household was a protective factor. And so, Dr. Kraus's background is in psychology, and so I don't know if there are any techniques from that, but just creating an environment where people feel comfortable. I mean, you're right, that is a very difficult question to answer because it would very much be on a case-by-case basis. And so, everyone's experiences loneliness and feelings of isolation differently, and so really understanding what's the root cause behind those feelings is important.
So I won't be very psychological with my response. Actually, I'm going to go to one of Susan's areas of expertise, peer support. I think it's very important people have a network, and the most reasonable network to build up is one with other people with spinal cord injury or disability. And I also think that a lot of loneliness, just any bad outcome, comes a lot from just what individuals face and the support that they have, not just in terms of social support, but in terms of community and other supports. So one thing that I did not mention in the presentation, but one of the things that we are working on is I'm working with people from the Minnesota Department of Health who routinely do surveillance of outcomes. And we're looking to identify people when they come into emergency departments, people that are out in the community with spinal cord injury long after they've had connection with specialty care, and trying to identify, use that as a way to reach people, to then provide them with information, be able to link them with the resources and services in their area. And so that's something that, again, if you can reach people and if you can circumvent some of the problems, if they have appropriate support, attendant care, critical issues for people with high spinal cord injuries, then you, I think, can begin to circumvent those questions, those issues.
I have a question, maybe an observation. I've often reflected, I took a Myers-Briggs test about 6 years before my injury, I've often wondered how much of that is that a baseline, or how have I changed from that inventory? I can see some consistency, but it has forced me to, if I need things done, I don't hesitate asking a stranger on the street to do that, which I don't know how much I have changed from the initial. Had personality tests uh, been involved in this study?
So we did not measure personality either in really early on in this study. One of the things I think that's a continual observation is people are, we are who we are. And so, no doubt our circumstance modify us moving forward, but, there has been some research, not necessarily recent research with spinal cord injury that, we tend to maintain continuity. And so a lot of times people that have more trouble after injury are people that were having a bit of trouble before, and sometimes that leading to injury. But over time, there is, growth and change and new challenges. But certainly, what people bring into to the table, so to speak, at the time of their injury, really, is reflected after their injury, and for a long time thereafter.
Thank you.
And Doctors Krause and Newman, I see Juan Albertorio from the CDC has a question. And Juan, I don't know if you got our messages. You could put it in the chat box, but if not, maybe we can unmute Juan. We have another kind of resident expert here on social isolation and loneliness, and I'd like for Juan to be able to ask his question.
Let me type it just in case, so we can have that documented, okay? I will put it there. Thank you.
Okay, so Juan is going to type his question in.
Where will we see
and
that?
So I have the chat box open. Actually, I'm monitoring it here. But Juan, in interest of time, and you're unmuted, please feel free to ask your question.
Okay. Hello. Thank you for the brilliant presentation. I really enjoy it. I have two questions, but I'll try to go first to the one that I would like to put in the chat, and is the following. I mean, due to the complexity of an approach for spinal cord injury, and the interest to use, and there any interest to use the current ICF courses for spinal cord injury to complement the study of social isolation. I think that the ICF will provide a framework that will help to integrate social isolation and loneliness via the psychosocial model. That mostly is my topic there.
You suggest using the ICF? Is that what you said?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Are you suggesting the World Health Organization's ICF?
That correct, yes. They currently have the ICF courses for spinal cord injury. And they have been using that for a while. And would be interesting to see if that model is already implemented for that kind of conditions can help to extend with the psychosocial model, which already implemented there, and extract the part that are associated with the social isolations, and perhaps help you to, to control further effects as well.
So I think the WHO models are very good, and I'll let Susan chime in a second. We have used WHO framework in a different part of our research, but I wasn't the lead author on that. And Nicole DePiero, who is doing some of that work, would have to remind me of the specifics. But so it can be difficult to use that sophisticated or detailed of a framework if you're not using it from the beginning. So in other words, if we set out to study something within the ICF, it's easier to then follow through and do it within that framework. So we've used the conceptualization that basically fit the two parameters of disconnectedness and perceived isolation, knowing that there's an objective component and a subjective component. And then we've searched our data. Dr. Lee does very sophisticated analyses. He has to translate them for us sometimes, quite honestly. I mean, he really does exceptional work within the structural equation modeling. And so, we're looking to identify things within that type of model, but it's possible to fit an ICF model, I believe. And but we have never done that with this data and these outcomes.
And this is Anne. Drs. Kraus and Newman, I have a question in the chat from our new NIDLR director that I would like to fit in here. So our director, Dr. Anjali Forber-Pratt, you may know her, and she has also done some work on social isolation and loneliness. So I'll read Dr. Forber-Pratt's question aloud, but please feel free to chime in, please. So it starts with, thank you, Jim and Susan, so much for your talk. I'm curious about your thoughts on social isolation for those who grow up with spinal cord injuries, either acquired at a young age or related conditions from birth. And secondly, second part, curious, and Dr. Kraus, you probably won't be surprised by my comment on how disability identity may be a protective factor.
I have to think about that. So, Susan, if you have any preliminary comments?
Well, it's not data-based, it's I guess anecdotal from my experience of working with folks who are injured at a very young age, very engaged with the community. And I think it speaks to that adaptation that they've grown up with the disability. And so it's a normal part of their circumstances. Now, these couple people don't represent everybody, but it seems like looking at that adaptation over time and time-since injury being protective in the data we looked at, you would think that people injured younger may have better adaptation over time and so less loneliness and social isolation. But again, that's just based on my anecdotal experiences.
So thinking about it a minute, I do think that for people that are injured or not injured at birth, that have congenital disability, it is different. And I wouldn't go from our research to that group because I just don't think we have good data. I do concur with Susan that a younger age at injury onset can be very facilitative of long-term outcomes because you have a lot of time to change, not necessarily change personality, but change of circumstance and to be able to restructure your goals. Though I was injured at 16, I guarantee you I wouldn't be here talking. I'd be somewhere out doing something where I stayed closer to home and probably did more fishing, and I would have never probably even gone to college. So I think there are profound effects, and it affects people differently. But when you're younger, you have more options and alternatives available to you, and I think that is largely facilitative. In terms of disability identity, I think that that's a really interesting concept because, how people see themselves and whether they see themselves as disabled versus non-disabled and whether they see it as a favorable thing or not will make a big difference. And so one thing that we've seen is that sometimes people who have had some responsibilities in their injury, it was very early research by Nancy, but I still believe true, that the people that can come to the conclusion are they like, something I did contributed to this, and therefore I have some control and I can change things, can do better often than people that don't do that. And then people who are able to encompass disability, again, talking about research going way back to Beatrice Wright, which was before my time, so it was a long time ago. And that people that sort of look at what they can do rather than what they can't, people that look and see a scope of values where they see what they're still able to do as an asset and to move forward. And then sometimes we see a lot of people, old time survivors in our study, and that one of the things is that they look back and they say, if this didn't happen to me, you know, well, I might not be alive. I might have went down a very different path. We hear that a lot. So I think all those factors are at play, and they certainly ultimately make a difference when you get to an outcome like social isolation, be it my evaluation of my situation or my actual activity pattern. So I hope that answers it.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much to you both for those comments. And I look forward to engaging with you more on some of these topics. So I very much appreciate it. It's interesting to think about, and just thank you so much for this such important work.
Thank you.
Great. And Doctors Newman and Kraus, I know we're past time, and there's still a few more questions in the chat. And so we'll just make sure that we can disseminate your contact information for those folks who do want to follow up with you. I know there was a question about the references for your presentation today. People would like to see that. And I know that did go out, your presentation did go out to registrants, so those references will be in there. So I do want to turn this back over to new additions to wrap up.
Not sure if they're there, but this is Dr. Forber Pratt, and I just want to say thank you so much to everyone who attended and who participated in the conversation and the Q&A. And we will make sure to forward on the questions that we didn't get to our presenters, and can follow up that way. Anne, anything else to jump in with?
Yeah, I was just going to say, we did have a final slide, and it's really just a save the date. There we go. There it is. Yeah, so as I said, it's a 4-part series, and so this is the save the date for our next episode in our social isolation and loneliness series. The title is Never Being Sought After by Anyone for Anything: Social Isolation and Loneliness Among Adults with Serious Mental Illnesses. And this is by Doctors McCormick and Salzer from Temple University. And that will be on Thursday, August 5th, 2 to 3 p.m. Again, thank you to our excellent presenters with hot off the press data, and also to all the participants today. And this webinar was recorded and will be archived. That audio file will be sent out to registrants, but you can also find it on NARIC.com, which is Neidler's clearinghouse for all of our information. And then we'll have it on ACL's Commit to Connect webpage as well. And that is it from me.